Does the book of Jude reference as scripture books not found in most modern Bibles? And where does the idea that angels fell from heaven come from in the New Testament, since the Hebrew Bible doesn't contain any such story, at least not explicitly? Let's consider the evidence. There are a handful of places in the New Testament that seem to take for granted that their audience knew of an account of angels falling from heaven. These include Jude and 2 Peter 2 and Revelation 20. It's interesting that they have this idea because no explicit story of angels falling from heaven is found in the Hebrew Bible. There are passages that sound like they might be referencing it, but they don't actually contain the story. This should not surprise us because the Bible mentions many other source texts as references. For instance, Joshua 10:13 says that the account of Joshua's miracle of causing the sun and moon to stand still was also found in the book of Jashar, which we no longer have. So where did the first century authors of the New Testament get the idea that angels fell from heaven because they rebelled against God? First, let's check out the Hebrew Bible's own references to at least a similar story so that we can fully see not only how ancient some versions of the story was, but also how the full story is missing from the Hebrew Bible. Probably the majority of Christians, if you ask them where the Old Testament account of angels falling from heaven comes from, would probably think of Genesis 6 first, but we'll come back to that in a moment. Let's begin with Isaiah 14:12 through 14. How you are fallen from heaven, O morning star of dawn! How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low! You said to yourself, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit on the mount of assembly, on the heights of Zephon. I will ascend to the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. Now, this passage is interesting for several reasons. Who is the passage speaking to? Well, if you're reading from the King James, which follows the Latin, you see the proper name Lucifer instead of the literal translation of morning star. And everyone knows who that is, right? But if we look at the immediate context of the chapter, we see that this particular prophecy is against the king of Babylon. And the name Lucifer didn't enter the text until the Vulgate translation. And by the way, the expression Lucifer doesn't occur anywhere else in the Bible. Now, there is actually a theological argument that this passage is talking about both Lucifer and the king of Babylon. It's a belief that the hosts of the heavens are sort of mirrored by the kings on the earth. And I go into this in chapter 6 and 8 of my book. But we don't need to wade into that here because all I want to point out is that there is no story here about angels falling from heaven. At most, this is only a reference to such a story, if you think it's saying that Satan fell from heaven. Also interesting is that the term morning star, which is translated in the Latin as Lucifer in Isaiah 14, also refers to Jesus himself in Revelation 22:16, also possibly 2 Peter 1:19. Interestingly, the King James doesn't call Jesus Lucifer in Revelation 22. Now let's skip ahead 10 chapters in Isaiah to check out a somewhat more promising reference, but still not the complete story of angels falling from heaven. Isaiah 24 speaks of Yahweh punishing the host of heaven, finally, and even casting them into a pit, imagery which seems to be borrowed by the Revelation 20 passage. However, we still have no explicit reference to what type of sin that the host of heaven committed, which Jude does mention, which we'll come back to in a moment. Plus, Isaiah seems to be predicting something that will happen in the future, along with some sort of apocalyptic judgment on the earth as well. Not something that happened thousands of years before, like in Genesis 6. And I said I wasn't going to go into it here, but go ahead and note the parallel in Isaiah 24:21 between what happened in heaven reflected in the events that happen on earth. Now let's turn to Genesis 6. When people began to multiply on the face of the ground, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that they were fair, and they took wives for themselves of all that they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for they are flesh. Their days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went into the daughters of humans, who bore children to them. These were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown. Here we find the well-known and fairly debated expression, sons of God, who produce offspring with the daughters of man. It also mentions the Nephilim, who were on the earth in those days. Even some Christians are not aware that there is a very commonly held belief among other Christians that this passage is about angels who came down to earth and had offspring with human women. We'll come back to this idea in a moment. Nephilim is Hebrew, and when you see a Hebrew word that goes untranslated, it can be because it was a proper name, or because we simply don't have a word for it in English, or even because it is not quite known what it was. For example, we're not sure exactly what the Urim and the Thummim were, both untranslated Hebrew words, although we know what they were used for. And the etymology of Azazel is uncertain, although earlier English translations created a word for it, the scapegoat. But what were the Nephilim? First, let's consider the etymology, then other evidence. You'll often hear people give the etymology of Nephilim as if we're certain about what it is. But we're not actually sure, partly because there are several possibilities. One possible etymology of Nephilim is great ones, or extraordinary ones, from the Hebrew palal, to distinguish, or pala, meaning extraordinary. There is even one theory that Nephilim means cloud people, from nephele, meaning cloud. But the one that probably gets the most attention is fallen ones, from the Hebrew napal or nafal, to fall. So which is it? Apart from Genesis 6:4, there is another reference to Nephilim in Numbers 13:33, to a group of people who are very big. The children of Israel are said to be like grasshoppers before them. This fits with the giants translation in the much later Latin, of course, and the theory that it's from the Hebrew word for great or extraordinary ones. We'll see more reasons why such a translation may have come to be in a moment. Interestingly, the passage says that they descended from the Nephilim, which would seem odd if it's the Nephilim of Genesis 6, and if one is to take the event of the flood at face value, which would have left only the descendants of Noah, unless you somehow bring in a lineage or three via his daughters-in-law. I've seen some believing scholars say that they simply called this group of people Nephilim because they were large, like the original Nephilim of Genesis 6. Another theory I saw says that there was a second incident of angels raping women after the flood, but the second time it was on a smaller scale. Well, thank Yahweh for that. You would be hard-pressed to lock up your daughters from creatures that descend from the skies. Anyway, back in Genesis 6:4, we have a possible translation of fallen ones, and we have a reference to sons of God. I have seen an argument that this must refer to angels because everywhere else in the Hebrew Bible, sons of God refers to angels, but this is actually not the case. It is also used for humans. We still do not have an explicit reference to angels being cast out of heaven to earth and impregnating women. However, in Genesis 6, I want to emphasize this, we do have an unexplained reference in which the author seems to expect us to know the story. And we do have extra biblical books that do in fact explain the story. The only question is, were such accounts written after the fact to explain the meaning of Genesis 6, or do they contain at least some of the background story that the author of Genesis 6 had in mind? We're not going to answer that question here. All I want to try to show is what at least some of the New Testament authors thought. Let's review our essential points so far. There is no explicit account of angels being cast out of heaven in the Hebrew Bible that we now have, even though in theory there could be an unexplained, implicit reference to them as a group in Genesis 6. What they are called may mean the fallen. However, note that if the etymology of Nephilim refers to their size, great or extraordinary ones, it does not seem logical to conclude that it also comes from the word for fallen. We should also note that Genesis 6 speaks of these sons of God on earth with no mention of punishment or being cast into the pit, as in Isaiah. When verse 5 begins to turn to God's punishment on the world, the focus is on man's sin. This is a gaping hole as to what is meant, and the extra biblical accounts provide a fair amount of material to try to plug it, as we'll see. So where did passages like Jude and 2 Peter 2:4 get their account of angels being cast down, past tense? It seems doubtful that they were just assuming that Isaiah 24 had been fulfilled, with no other biblical explanation to tell when or how that happened. There may have been other details regarding the Nephilim from accounts that we no longer possess, but there are multiple accounts that do survive, and they are found all through the Apocrypha, written in the 3 centuries before Christ. These fill in many gaps in the history of Israel, as well as provide the development of various new religious ideas, along with some very colorful retellings of many of the accounts of the Hebrew Bible. Mentions of the Nephilim and their judgment are found in Sirach 16:7, Baruch 3:26-28, and Wisdom 14:6. Note that none of these, like the Hebrew Bible, explicitly mention angels being cast from heaven. For that reference, we now turn to 1 Enoch, which is not included in the most common list of books of the Apocrypha, although the Orthodox Tewahedo canon, used by 2 large churches of Africa, does include it, even though the Britannica article on 1 Enoch states that no canon includes it. Rude. Jubilees is found in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church's canon and also contains an account of the fallen angels and their sexual sin. It also connects them to the Watchers, like 1 Enoch. By the way, the term Watchers also appears in Daniel 4:17. Some sects of Judaism, possibly including Qumran, whose library included 1 Enoch and Jubilees, and some early patristic Christian writers considered the accounts of 1 Enoch to be true. They believed, as many still do today, that the Nephilim were offspring of human women and angels, that they were literally giants, 300 cubits tall, and that the flood was intended to wipe them out. And get this, that their souls remained on earth as demons. In other words, it's an origin story for demons. Recall that demon possession also is only found in the New Testament, with no explanation as to why it's not found in the Hebrew Bible. While 2 Peter 2:4 does not quote its source, Jude 14-15 uses the language of 1 Enoch 1:9, which itself appears to borrow some language from Deuteronomy 33:2. In fact, Jude gives us other details that line up with the 1 Enoch explanation of Genesis 6, like that their sin was sexual in nature. See verses 6 and 7. In fact, I would argue that Jude appears to be quoting this account exactly like the New Testament writers quote the rest of the Hebrew Bible, as authoritative scripture. As I said, early patristic writers agreed, and some even included 1 Enoch in the canon, as we've seen in previous lessons. Again, I'm not making a judgment about whether the Bible is complete. I'm merely trying to flesh out various viewpoints of the actual authors, like what might the author of Jude say about the completeness of modern canons. Not only that, but many early Christians thought Jude itself did not belong in the canon, quite possibly because it quoted from 1 Enoch, which scholars, and probably many early Christians, believe to have originated during the Hellenistic period, long after the pre-Diluvian man named Enoch, who was supposed to have written it. The letter of Jude speaks vaguely about those who crept in among them, but who were not true Christians. Along with sexual sins and rejection of Jesus, the author accuses these false Christians of blaspheming angels. Some scholars have therefore wondered whether this was an opposing view to the doctrine in Colossians, which condemns those who give undue prominence to angels, worshiping them. Then Jude cites a passage to prove that not even angels revile the devil, where Michael says, quote, "The Lord rebuke you," end quote, to Satan, regarding the body of Moses. This incident is not found anywhere in the Hebrew Bible either. In fact, we don't have it anywhere else, but one educated guess as to where it came from is a book called The Testament of Moses from the middle of the 1st century. We only have the first part of this book. The ending has been lost. However, such an incident of an angel arguing with the devil over the body of Moses would fit into the storyline of the Testament of Moses if we had the second half. The first half begins with Moses' exhortations to Joshua before he dies. It should also be noted that Jude was not written in a vacuum. It does not merely reflect the beliefs of a single author. In the second half of the 1st century, when it was composed, it had enough of an audience who not only knew about the books it referenced, but also respected them. In other words, Jude is reflective of beliefs of at least a significant community at the time, significant enough for it to stay in print before the printing press, and significant enough for it to end up in the Bible itself. At least 2 of the early patristic writers of the 2nd century also took the book seriously, Clement of Alexandria and Tertullian. And Josephus, who wrote around 93 AD, included many Enochic events directly in his history of the Jews, including the details of the giants birthed from angels and women, which he equates to similar Greek tales. If you're wondering whether any of the rest of the New Testament also shows any sign of relying on pseudepigrapha like 1 Enoch, James 5:11 has a possible reference to the Testament of Job, which was written around the 6th century BC, speaking of the quote-unquote perseverance of Job. Of course, the Hebrew Bible contains the story of Job, but only the Testament of Job harps on his perseverance. So James has a possible reference to a pseudepigraphal work. Perhaps the most remarkable, likely, and glaring reference to a pseudepigraphal work, apart from Jude's direct quote of Enoch, is the 1,000-year reign of the Messiah in Revelation 20, verse 3, which is clearly already found in 1 Enoch 21:6. 2 Peter 2:5 also mentions that Noah was a preacher of righteousness, which is not found in the Hebrew Bible, but is found in Josephus's Antiquities, so was probably a well-known, existing, and accepted detail from non-biblical sources which we no longer have. And while we're on the topic of Jude and extra-canonical books, note that he also mentions that Michael is an archangel, which is not made explicit anywhere in the Hebrew Bible. Actually, Michael is only mentioned in the Bible in the later apocalyptic book of Daniel. The Hebrew Bible's earlier mentions of angels give us almost no detail about them, and certainly no names. Then suddenly Daniel names 2 angels, the other of which is Gabriel. These 2 named angels also both make an appearance in the New Testament. 1 Thessalonians 4:16 also mentions the idea of an angel. Where do these 2 New Testament authors get the idea of a hierarchy of angels? Once again, we find them in the deuterocanonical works and the pseudepigrapha. Many of the New Testament writers were almost certainly not just using our Hebrew Bible. Scholars have speculated that Israel developed a fascination with angels during the Babylonian captivity, and especially when they lived among the Persians, who replaced the Babylonian Empire, as the Persian Zoroastrianism contains much focus on angels and demons. But that is a topic for another time. In Chapter 6 of my book, I also cover how Hebrews 9 relies on details only found in extra-biblical writing, and a few examples of other New Testament mentions of doctrines not found in the Hebrew Bible, but only in rabbinic sources. For more answers to Bible questions you probably never knew begged to be asked, make sure to check out the links below.